Welcome, Richard. It's a great pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're looking forward to talking to you about our wild calling and how connecting with animals can transform our lives and save theirs. I've enjoyed reading your latest book, Our Wild Calling, and would love for you to talk about that in just a minute. But first, before we do that, you're well known for the term nature deficit disorder, which you coined in your earlier book, Last Child in the Woods. Tell us what that's all about.
Nature deficit disorder was the kind of, at the time, tongue-in-cheek phrase that I used in Last Child in the Woods, that I used, I think, once or twice in the book itself. And then my publisher suggested that that might want to be on the cover, that phrase. And I resisted, being a hoity-toity journalist who would never stoop to a bumper sticker statement. I resisted, but fortunately they convinced me, and it's in the subtitle, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. And that was in Last Child in the Woods. That book was about the severe and relatively sudden disconnect between children, which means adults because they grow up, and the natural world. I made the argument in 2005 that that was changing just about everything, about conservation, about mental health, physical health, cognitive functioning, the way we relate to the world. And this was happening for a number of reasons, among them electronics, but we can't blame Mark Zuckerberg for everything. Also bad urban design. Education was devaluing nature. And we can talk about that more later if you want. But largely it was fear of stranger danger, even though that was blown way up by my profession of journalism. Particularly, I think it was those electronic guys, not us print guys, but people became very, very afraid, beginning in the 70s and growing in the 80s and the 90s, to the point where the circumference that kids could wander from their own house, which was for our grandparents was even miles, our great-grandparents, has been steadily moving inward. Now it's at the front stoop. And now kids are raised under virtual protective house arrest too often, not all. This is particularly evident in the pandemic. And what's the result of that? What happens when kids and the rest of us don't get enough nature? And I put together the research that was just then coming out about the benefits of nature to child development and human development throughout our lives. And I asked, what happens when you take that away? When I wrote Last Child, there were about 60 studies that I could comfortably cite. This was largely ignored, the impact of nature on human development, by the academic world. There were a few pioneers, but this was, I think, literally the elephant in the room. And since then, though, since Last Child came out in 2005, the number of studies that we have on our website, the Children Nature Network, which is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child, is now over 1,000. And we're getting studies from somewhere in the world that we're abstracting at 10, 15, 20 a month. What was once ignored is now a growth industry. And almost all this research points in one direction, which is our connection with nature, not only as kids, but as adults, is fundamental to our humanity, fundamental to our physical and mental health and our cognitive abilities. It's much more important than I realized when I started writing Last Child in the Woods.
You know, when you make that comment about children growing up and the degree to which they roam, I remember my childhood and how me and my siblings would travel far and wide around our neighborhood, and how my children that I raised that had shrunk significantly. They were lucky in that they grew up here in Big Bear Lake, and they had a forest nearby to roam about in, but I think that's more the exception. And then as I look at nieces and nephews and younger people, you can definitely see that trend of our childhood environment shrinking around us. So, Richard, as you know, we at Chirp are all about connecting people to nature using wild birds as inspiration. So this idea of connecting to nature really resonates with us and with our extended Chirp family and friends. So that's one of the reasons why we're really excited to be able to talk with you today. So I appreciate that perspective of how it got started, and jump ahead a bit to where you may be now in your understanding of some of these challenges with your latest book, Our Wild Calling. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's about?
Well, first, let me say that, you live in Big Bear, which you're very lucky to live there. It's a wonderful place. And my wife and I live in Julian, California, which is up in the mountains east of San Diego, a little bit like Big Bear, but without as much water. And we're lucky. We have lots of nature around us. And when I said that, when I described the fear that parents feel more now than ever, it's, and that so much of that is unjustified. If you look at the actual statistics, for about 40 years, violence toward children outside the home was going down. What was going up is the 24-hour coverage of a relative few, one is too many, but a relative few stranger abductions, for instance. Some neighborhoods, though, are dangerous. Some neighborhoods, it's pretty hard to find nature, but you still can. It's still in those neighborhoods. This applies to even the most densely populated urban neighborhood. You can look out the window, and we're experiencing this now with the pandemic. When I was asked by the LA Times to write a piece out of Last Child in the Wood, out of Our Wild Calling, about how people were relating to animals during the pandemic. And I'd already noticed, as everybody had, that the shelters, there's a run on cats and dogs and pets, and it's hard to even find one. Although now many of them are being abandoned, that were taken home during the most harshest days of the pandemic. But also, I started getting emails and calls from people, because of the books I've written, saying that they'd looked out the window and they had noticed for the first time that there were birds out there. Now, they'd noticed birds before, but had they really noticed them? Had they really paid attention? And the reason this was happening, it wasn't only birds, it was the possum that's wandering through the yard, or the coyote that turned and made eye contact with them. The reason they were noticing now is because they were extremely lonely. They were inside. It was forced, not forced. Because of circumstances now, they had to be inside a whole lot more. And when they looked out their window and they saw, the birds, maybe the raptor that landed in a tree, or if they were in an urban setting, the raptor that landed on a ledge on a building across the road and made a nest, and they became fixated on that nest, they realized they didn't feel so alone. They took comfort in these animals that they saw outside their window. And I think many of us realized, sometimes for the first time, that we belong to a much larger family. And this gives us comfort. To the degree that we are separated from that larger extended family, we are more lonely. And loneliness was one of the themes of Our Wild Calling, which is about our relationship, not only with our pets, but also with wild animals. A few decades ago, medical folks started noticing a pandemic that now is a parallel pandemic to COVID, which is the pandemic of human isolation. And it was found that the diseases that are associated with human isolation happen to be many of the same ones that are associated with obesity and uh, smoking. Many of the causes for that isolation happen to be the same causes that are keeping kids and adults indoors and disconnected from nature. So it's a little bit of a double whammy. And in Our Wild Calling, I talk about many of the reasons for this disconnect, for this human loneliness, which happen to be some of the same ones that are disconnecting children from nature and the rest of us from nature. And I make the case that there's a deeper loneliness going on here. It's not only electronics and fear and bad urban design. I make the case that there is a deeper loneliness that is always with us, that is species loneliness. That as a species, we are desperate to not feel alone in the universe. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? Why else would we look for intelligent life on other planets when it may not be a good idea to find it? It's because there is something deep within us as a species that is desperate not to feel alone in the universe. The irony is, and this has religious implications, obviously, that we are not alone. We are surrounded by a great conversation. If we pay attention, we will hear it and can participate in it. And that's of the life around us, not only birds and coyotes and possums, but also the trees around us. The more that science knows about the communication among animals and trees, for instance, the more they know about how much communication is going on, not only within those species, but across species and with us, the more that conversation becomes important to us, I think. And so much has been learned in the last few years that I make the case that this is extraordinarily important for the future of us. It's extraordinarily important for the future of nature itself for us to recognize it.
Yeah, it seems rather ironic to me that in this age and time, when we are probably more digitally connected than we have ever been, right? And we're just a Facebook app away from friends and family and all that. The reality, as you have mentioned and you underline, is that emotionally we're probably more disconnected than we ever have been. And it's just ironic to me that we can, in some ways, feel so connected and yet not be.
Although we're not more connected by Facebook and all that, we've heard the recent testimony. Our speech is not free on Facebook. It's controlled. It's chaperoned. It's sent into pockets of people like ourselves. We're made to be angry so that we make more links for Facebook to sell more ads. So, this idea that we're so connected through electronics, I think, needs to be questioned and is being questioned. Obviously, I like Zoom. I don't have to get on as many airplanes.
Right.
So.
Right. There are advantages to this, and one is that we get the ability to be able to have this conversation with you that we might not otherwise be able to do. So when we talk about this connection to nature, what remarkable experiences have you been exposed to? Maybe specifically experiences between people and birds, of course, are of special interest to us at Chirp. What can you share with us about that?
Well, to write Our Wild Calling, I collected, I think, hundreds of stories that people told me or wrote to me by email, or I interviewed people. Obviously, they're not all in the book, but they were remarkable stories, either about relationships that people had had with their companion animals, or more often encounters and even relationships they'd had with wild animals, over time. And there were some remarkable similarities in the stories that people told, common denominators. I'll share one story with you, which is about birds. It's storytelling about an experience I had. I was on a lake near San Diego once, and I have a little aluminum boat, and it has a little electric motor. It's very quiet. It was the early morning, and this is an area of the lake where you see coyotes and all kinds of wildlife. Deer come down to the bobcats come down to the shore, and I saw on the shore what I thought, were two big turkey buzzards that were eating a dead carp on the shore. And so with my quiet motor, I eased up toward them, curious. You don't get within 20 feet of golden eagles very often. These were not turkey buzzards. These were two very large golden eagles. And they were eating a dead carp. And one of them flew up around a peak and then came back down. And they stayed there, even though I was just 20 feet away. And I kind of quietly went back and forth with my electric motor. And for what seemed like forever, we did this. The eagles would lean down, looking at me with eye contact, would lean down and take a bite of the carp and then come back up. And then lean down, take a bite of the carp and come back up. Their eyes never leaving mine. That seemed like it went on forever. One of the common characteristics of the stories that people tell, and many of them told me that I was the first one they told their stories to about their encounters, because a lot of us are embarrassed by these stories and the meaning we find in them. But many of them said that during those encounters, time seemed to stop or bend. There were other altered states, like sense of scale disappears or changes radically. The time issue happened with me. I felt that when I was engaged with those eagles, and I'm sure many of the people who are listening to this have had those kinds of experiences. I went home and I told my younger son, who was home from college that weekend, about this, and that, like so many of the people's stories I collected, something had happened. It had happened between me and the eagles. I can't speak for the eagles. Maybe they were just trying to decide if I was edible. But I know that something happened right here. And I said, Matthew, I can't explain. This is beyond human language. And again, I found a guy an oceanographer who had a similar experience with an octopus on the bottom of the ocean that grabbed him, a big 12-foot wingspan octopus that grabbed him. And on the way up, he realized he was out of air, and the octopus started coming around here, moving around him as they were going up in the column of water. He could feel the razor sharp beak of the octopus coming around his neck until he was looking right into the eye of the octopus.
Wow.
This is Paul Dayton, who is one of the famous oceanographers in the world among oceanographers. He's about 80 now. And he said something happened. And he laughs at himself, risking, of course, anthropomorphism, which I think is highly underrated. He said, there's something happened in those moments. He said, I think the octopus and I made our non-aggression pact. And right then they hit the surface. Both of them were above the surface. Paul rips off his mask. He sees the octopus starting to sink down below the surface. He's looking at it under the surface, and he sees it start to recede into the darkness. And what does Paul do? He puts his mask back on and he chases. He swims after the octopus down into the dark. And then he told me something he didn't tell me, I didn't have in the book. I wish I'd had that detail. As they went down, they spiraled each other until he couldn't breathe anymore, and Paul shot to the surface. Now, he is a hardcore, highly respected scientist. And again, he kind of laughs at himself. He says, there's something kind of spiritual at that moment. He says, I don't know whether it was spiritual, but here's what I do know. I did not want those moments to end. When people open up about these encounters they have, particularly with wild animals, they often say something like that. So the search of the book is, what is that? You know, it happens with our pets. A woman in Toronto told me she walked into her room, the living room one day, and her 6-year-old son is on the carpet with his arm around their family dog, big dog named Jack. And she hears her 6-year-old son say, "Mommy, I don't have a heart anymore." She said, "What are you saying?" Without looking up, her 6-year-old says, "My heart is in Jack." What is that? That permeability between two beings. We felt that with people. We also feel that with our extended family, with the other animals out there. You know, I felt it with the eagles.
And
And
Richard, how would you explain that then?
well, it took a book to try to explain it, and I think I did. This is oversimplifying, but there's an essay by a great philosopher, Martin Buber. I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. Martin Buber, who wrote an essay called I Am Thou. And what he said is that you and I don't actually exist, not really. What exists is between us, the relationship. Now, he used that word in a different way than maybe you and I do. He thought of that thing between us, that relationship, as a kind of electricity that some people call God. And that's what I heard so many of these people saying. They weren't using those words, but they were saying, so I like to name things. And Martin Buber was talking about people, and I was picking up these stories about people with their encounters with birds and coyotes and all kinds of animals. And so what I call that thing between us and other animals is the habitat of the heart.
Mm.
I think there are two habitats. There is the physical, natural habitat that we spend a lot of time and energy and money, as we should, trying to protect and teaching our children about. But then there's this other habitat, the habitat of the heart. And we spend very little time focusing on that or teaching our children about it or talking about it even. But here's the deal. If one of those habitats, one of those two habitats goes, so does the other one. So I think the future of environmentalism and our relationship with nature on this earth has a lot to do with discovering or maybe rediscovering, because others have known about this. Indigenous people, our ancestors certainly knew about it and told stories about it around the fire, and sometimes acted out the story and became the bear. You know, I think the future of our relationship with nature has as much to do with the habitat of the heart as it does with the physical habitat.
That emotional element, and as they say, what's old is new again. You mentioned, Richard, about these encounters, and um, in your book, I was especially intrigued by this idea of engagement patterns, I believe is what you call it, where both humans and animals have a process or list of ways we engage with one another. And at the beginning of that list, you have to recognize and be recognized. And that that struck me as being, of course, very important for us as human beings. How that's, the very first thing we would do, assuming we're being polite with one another, is to say hello and recognize someone. And in fact, a big slight would be to not recognize someone. And then, of course, you have described, and you describe in your book, that recognition with animals. But can you speak to that a bit, about these patterns that we share as humans also with other beings?
Well, first, I think I found it ironic that you remember the movie Avatar,
Mm.
and there are sequels coming, prequel and sequel, I think, from the director of Avatar. And the way that people greet each other on the planet Pandora is "I see you." And the list that I put together, and by the way, the director and producer of Avatar said at the time that his movie was about, quote, nature deficit disorder, unquote. And he's been quoted recently about the sequels as saying the same thing. I wrote a blog teasing him and saying, well, if you really believe that, maybe you should support some of the many nonprofits that are trying to connect kids to nature. I haven't heard back from him. I still am holding out hope. But these methods of, basically this is a list that Pat Hasbach, who is a noted ecotherapist, ecopsychologist, and she is a professor at the, I can't think of the name of the college in Oregon. It's a famous college. And she's been collecting these ways that kind of cross species boundaries in terms of communication with between species, among species. And her list starts with recognizing and being recognized. You know, I see you. Engaging in playful interactions with another animal or animals, exhibiting empathy, what she calls crossing the threshold. And that's her expression for entering the psychological or spiritual space that exists between two animals. Becoming the animal. You know, our ancestors who danced around the fire and told stories about the bear encounter, suddenly they became the bear in telling the story. There's something now called critical anthropomorphism that uses that technique as a scientific method for asking the right scientific questions about other species.
Richard, explain quickly what anthropomorphism means.
Well, anthropomorphism is projecting human qualities onto other animals. That's its most base definition. But another way to look at it is that it's empathy. It is feeling what you think that animal may be feeling or thinking. There's a thing called critical anthropomorphism, as I mentioned, that is being used by some scientists. The guy named Bergdorf is the guy that is promoting this the most. He says, if you're going to study a snake, you need to become the snake. You need to do two things as when you're with that snake. You need to conjure up, and this would be for birds too, by the way, but you need to conjure up as much of the scientific, hard scientific knowledge that you have about that, say, bird. And then you have to do something else. You have to use your imagination. What's it like to be that eagle? Yeah. What's it like to be that snake? You have to become the eagle, the best of your ability to do, or become the snake. It is speculative, but so is a lot of empathy. He says only when you do both those two steps, the scientific thing, conjuring all you know about, you know, what is that snake doing with its tongue? What is it sensing? And then secondly, imagine from your own experience what that snake might be experiencing. He says only after you do those two things can you ask the best scientific questions about the snake or the bird. And there's another one she has, using intonement, which is singing tones or monotones. But to this list also, there's other things like certain types of behavior, physical behavior. In the book, in Our Wild Calling, I call that the oldest language. This predates verbal language, predates ours. And we share it with other species. And she is doing a catalog of what she calls nature language, what I call the oldest language. And, you know, squirrels share some of the sounds of birds, and birds share some of the sounds, the warning sounds, et cetera. So there is a kind of common language out there that we share that we don't pay any attention to particularly. Some of us do. I mean, certainly some of the folks that you work with do, and I'm sure you do also. People like John Young, who teaches bird language. He's not so much talking about how to talk with birds. he takes people out of the woods and to notice, really begin to pay attention to the behavior of the birds, the sounds of the birds, and what those behaviors and sounds and actions mean. And that's the oldest language part of it.
That's his book, What the Robin Knows, right? And the idea of a sit spot and
Right.
sitting and being still and quiet and paying attention to what's around you as what's around you gets more and more used to you. Yeah, that's a great read.
And it's important to
as
say
well.
that he didn't come up with this stuff. I mean, he's wonderful. I like him, but this predates John and all of us and indigenous people. You know, we have limited our emotions, our thinking, our experience in the modern world. And so much of this is rediscovering old knowledge, not appropriating it from indigenous people, but appreciating it, acknowledging it, and saying, there's something in all of us that knows that oldest language.
Mm-hmm. Richard, I'm curious. In your life, has either a lack of connection to nature, or perhaps as you've learned and researched and grown more connected to nature, how has that affected you personally?
Well, it helps to write books about this to, accelerate your appreciation for that connection. But from the very beginning, I mean, people ask me where these books come from, and how did you get interested? I said, well, actually, I was a kid once, and I spent a lot of my time in the woods with my dog, whose picture you can see right above me there. There he is. That's Banner. He's a collie. And I spent much of my time in the woods with Banner. My parents often did not know where I was, but Banner always did. And when I would be up to no good, my mother would know it because Banner would go home. And he knew when I was getting into trouble. And one time I tell the story or while calling, I fell through some ice in a creek. And this time he left, but then he came back. And he's part of the reason that I got out of that water, that ice water. So I've always had that. And I spent a lot of time in the woods. Kids are more open to the oldest language. They're more open to this habitat of the heart than adults tend to be. And much of what we do with education and modern life kind of stamps that out in many kids. A few of us stay 11, and we still have it.
So, Richard, what would you recommend to the rest of us to perhaps reverse that? What would be a good place to start?
With Our Wild Calling, I was on a radio. I was on the book tour in March when COVID hit, and so much of I had a whole summer and fall of speeches around the country and overseas too that had been scheduled, and those, of course, were wiped out. And I was in part relieved because I was getting pretty tired of airplanes, but it shifted to Zoom and the radio interviews. And I remember I was on a very long, these are called radio tours, where you sit in one room, you talk to one radio station after another. And for some reason in Canada, they all had the same list of questions they asked me. And the last one was always, well, what's the one takeaway from Our Wild Calling? And it kind of irritated me after a while. How do you sum up, 340 or whatever it is pages, in one word or one idea? And then I realized that I had already said that. I already solved that problem in the introduction to the book. I talk about in Alaska on Kodiak Island when I was with my son there, walking up a path between the cabins, and a fox. See, these are some of the largest foxes in the world on Kodiak. Was right in my way. It was a dark fox, and with piercing eyes, and it wouldn't let me pass. was right there. I thought, is this fox rabid? Is there a problem here? And I looked into this fox's eyes, and I didn't see familiarity particularly. I saw another universe, to overstate it, or maybe not to overstate it. And it stopped me in my tracks. And finally I said, I'm going up to the lodge up there. And by the way, I'd been looking in my wallet because I needed some money at the lodge. And there's Alaskan brown bears there. There's grizzlies, essentially, all over the place. I should not have been doing that. When I saw those eyes, I thought it was a bear at first. And so I said, I'm going up to the lodge. Would you like to go with me to the fox? And I stepped forward, the fox stepped aside, and then I kept going, and the fox trotted along next to me all the way up to the lodge and then veered off into the grass. I found out later they were not feeding that fox. Something else was going on. So the end of that introduction, I say, I don't know why that happened. I could get all new agey and say, the fox was trying to tell me something. I don't know what the fox was trying to tell me. Maybe it was just trying to tell me to pay attention. That's the moral of the story. That's what the book is about. Pay attention. Listen to that conversation that's all around us.
Yeah.
Realize that we're not alone on this earth.
Put down your devices. Put down your devices. Look outside, walk outside, and pay attention. That's good stuff, Richard. I want to thank you for taking time, making time for us. I know you were kind enough to sign a bunch of books for us. We have several of your different books, including Our Wild Calling, that we have here at Chirp for people to pick up a copy if they like. So I appreciate that, Richard, very much. And I appreciate your making time for us. And please, if you're ever up in Big Bear Lake, I hope you will stop in and say hello to us. And if you have an extra half hour, maybe we can even take a little stroll into the woods together. I would certainly love that.
That'd be great. And by the way, I wrote a couple chapters of The Nature Principle, one of the books that you have at Big Bear. My wife and I rented a cabin up there, and I love Big Bear. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing, and the folks out there like you who are paying attention.
Well, thank you.
Okay,
Richard. Well, take care, and I'll look forward to meeting you in person one day.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Bye.